Hi, I'm Liam. If you don't know me, I work at Future Publishing. We work on some fairly big sites you might have heard of, like Tech Radar and PC Gamer. And localization has been a pretty big part of how these brands have been growing their audience over the last couple of years. Before that, I've worked to bring localization functionality to various web apps, game software, and other applications. So I've kind of been doing it for a little while now. But what is localization? In a broad sense, localization is taking a product like a website or an application and changing it so that it can work in a particular market or region. That might mean translating some text for it. It might mean adding new features like accepting certain payment methods, being able to accept payments from their currency. It might mean changing some imagery around so that it's more appropriate for their culture. And there's a lot of different facets to it, but it's pretty rewarding if you do manage to localize something, because only about 20% of the world speaks English, so you're missing out on about 80% of your potential audience if you don't take the time to localize something. Today I'm going to share a couple of tips that I've basically been using over a couple of localization projects in the past to help you avoid pain of localization, because there are a lot of things that can really catch you out and take up time to fix later down the line. So the first tip that I'm going to give you is basically, if you're not already, use UTF-8 everywhere. UTF-8 is a text encoding standard, kind of like ASCII, but it's better because it can let you have millions and millions of different characters, and ASCII doesn't support anywhere near that many. You basically need to be using UTF-8 if you want to support a lot of Eastern language scripts like Korean or Japanese or Chinese. You also need to use it if you want to support emoji in your text, but it's also backwards compatible with ASCII, so if you have an existing application, you can kind of push UTF-8 into it without having to worry about your existing data being incompatible. But where do you use UTF-8? Where do you have to decide where to use it and where you just use ASCII, or how does it work? You probably want to be accepting UTF-8 content wherever you're accepting user input, if you're accepting like a contact form or letting someone type in their name or anything, because they might have Chinese characters in their name, they might want to type emoji in it. So basically, the first place you need to worry about is in your database. So whenever you create a database table or a database table, you get to choose the encoding type and the character set that you get to use in it. By default, this usually isn't UTF-8, so you want to make sure that you select that when you set it up. With the one exception, in MySQL, UTF-8 isn't really UTF-8, so don't use that. Instead, you should use the one that's called UTF-8 MB4, because that will give you the full character set and you won't run into problems with it. Another place you need to make sure that you're using it is in your HTML. It's pretty simple to do. You just declare the character set with a meta tag. If you don't do this, you won't be able to display Unicode characters on your web pages, and you'll have a bit of problems if you try to accept form input from people. In your PHP code, there's a lot of places that you need to worry about accepting UTF-8 and how you deal with it. There's a lot of particular functions that PHP has that deal with this. So there's UTF-8 encode, which you probably want to use if you're importing data into DOM document, if you're dealing with HTML or XML. There's lots of functions like HTML special characters that accept a character set as a parameter, and you need to make sure that you read the documentations for your functions and that they'll work with the encoding type that you want to use. You also need to be able to set a UTF-8 header in the response of your HTTP requests, because otherwise the browser won't know what to do with it necessarily. So you can just do that by appending character set UTF-8 to the content type header when you send that. And there's a lot of multi-byte functions that PHP has as well. There's, for example here, the string length function. If you try and use the string length function on like an emoji flag, it'll actually count the number of bytes that are in that text, not the number of characters that are in it. But the multi-byte version will actually say the correct number. You're probably looking at emoji flag and thinking, why does it say 2? It looks like 1. That's because a lot of Unicode characters let 2 special other characters be joined together. So in this case, a Unicode flag for this is just the G and the B special characters sort of together. So the multi-byte version actually reports the right thing. And you need to worry about this a lot in your code, because if you start using the non-multi-byte versions, but you're putting in multi-byte text, and you're trying to manipulate it, you're going to get offset, and you're going to be doing the wrong things with it, and it's really hard to diagnose if you end up doing that 6 months down the line. Another place that you really have to worry about it is in your IDE, which is kind of maybe a bit of a weird thing to think about. So this is a screenshot of a VS Code here, and at the bottom right, by default, you get to select the encoding type. And if you set this to something other than UTF-8, or it's not set to UTF-8 by default, like I think Notepad++ and Eclipse don't set it to UTF-8 by default, and you have Unicode text in your source code, it's just not going to work like you think, and you're going to get weird characters showing up in your pages. So another tip I've got to give you is to give your translations some context. So let's have a little look at an example here. We've got a lovely little UI, and we want to translate this to Chinese. So this is how you might do it in something like Laravel Blade, and you pass through the text that you want to see, like in this case it's sign up. We pass it through to a translation function, and in that function we can like look up what the current language the user has is, and figure out in a lookup table what to do with that. That looks kind of fine, because in your source code you get to see like what the text actually is. You still see that it says sign up here. But let's take a look at it in this example where we're translating name in 2 different places. If we try to use this and translate it to Chinese, we get these characters here. That might be fine in some cases, but here in Chinese, this word that we've got actually just refers to the name of a person. So it doesn't really work down here where we're asking for the name of a team. And so we can't have the same parameter in both these places. It just won't work out, and this happens in a lot of languages where they just have different words that mean things in different languages. So one way that I like to deal with this is to, instead of passing through the text you want to see, rename it to give it some kind of semantic meaning as a key that you can use for your lookup table. And this way you can have 2 different things for, you can have the same text, the same text for English, but different text for other languages if you need it. So ideally, each place that you're displaying something in one context, you would just have a key that you can refer to instead of the text itself. Quickly about time zones. This is a time zone map. It's super confusing. I think genuinely time zones are one of the most difficult things to do in programming, and they get immediately more complicated if you're trying to do something that spans multiple time zones, or if you're trying to have recurring events that may go through daylight savings and stuff. They span both geographical and political borders, so they wrap around countries, so they're not that consistent with the way they work. Sometimes some time zones go through daylight savings, so the hours change either 1 or 2 hours during winter or summertime, but they don't all do it at the same time. So when we changed our clocks back a few weeks ago, it wasn't at the same date that America does. So all of a sudden we're like an extra hour out of step with them, and that can be very confusing. Especially if you've got like a meeting that you're trying to book into a calendar, and it's booked in one time for one person, and then all of a sudden it's shifted off for someone else. But there are a couple of tips that you can have to deal with time zones a little bit better, and to not run into so many problems with them. The first one is to use UTC everywhere that you're storing time zones. UTC means Universally Coordinated Time. Yeah, it's a mixture of English and French, but it doesn't match either of them. We used to call it GMT, but we pretty much call it UTC everywhere now. It's a standard time zone, so basically everyone uses it and every programming language supports it. You get to, it doesn't have daylight savings, so it's consistent throughout the year. And you basically want to use it everywhere that you're transferring date times as data. So if you're storing it in your database, or if you're accepting a date time from user input from the browser, you probably want to have it in UTC, because that way your whole code base only has to deal with one date time, time zone. But after that, you probably want to display it back into the user's local time zone, because you don't want to confuse them by displaying a UTC time if they're not in UTC. And that can be pretty easy to do. There's lots of things that support that. If you're using JavaScript, you can use something like moment.js. If you're using PHP, I recommend the Carbon datetime library. But the tricky thing here is actually figuring out what the user's local time zone is, because it's not that easy to begin with. And there's a couple of ways you can do it. You could ask what the time zone is where they sign up, but you may be displaying dates for users that don't sign up, so you can't really rely on that. You might try to guess their time zone based on geolocation data, but especially with people using VPNs more now, this isn't really reliable because you may assume that they're in a different country than they really are. So you can't really rely on that either. The thing that I think is most reliable is just let their browser's JavaScript handle it, because their browser is always aware of what time zone the current user's in, and if they go on holiday and they're in a different country, it'll be aware of that kind of thing. So you can give this UTC time zone back to your user's browser and let the JavaScript that you've written deal with it, and they'll pretty much always be as accurate as you can get. The one exception for this is if you're giving a time for a specific physical location, like a conference or this meetup here. This meetup's happening in England, so we probably always want to display the time for that in the current time in England, because it doesn't really make sense to display it any other way for people. There's another tip here, which is don't change the default time zone between requests. I've seen this one too many times. People try to be smart and they change the default time zone that PHP uses at the beginning of their requests as soon as they figure out what user the time zone's in. Don't do this. Please don't do this. The reason is because all your dates then, all the logs that you create, all your database entries, they'll be in different time zones for each person that made the request. And you'll never be able to figure it out and what happened. So just keep it UTC everywhere you can, and you'll just have a much easier time. Some of the tips I've got for you, I've got a couple of links here. If you want to follow my blog or follow me on Twitter and GitHub, I'll post the slides later today. I'm working on a site called l10n.academy if you want to go and sign up, and you can, I'll be giving lots of resources and tips about localization, very in-depth, much more in-depth than this. So if you're interested in that and you want to localize a project, I highly recommend you look it up. The PHP manual has some very good documentation about when to use Unicode and UTF-8 and how to deal with it in PHP. There's a whole section for it in the manual. Go and read that if you haven't already. But if you take nothing else away from this talk, go and read this post by Zach Holman called UTC is Enough for Everyone, right? It's a really deep dive on what problems time zones have and the different quirks they have and why you have to worry about them so much when you're dealing with them in programming. Thanks, that's me.